You just spent your last dollar on a box of junk. The laughter came fast and sharp from somewhere behind Travis Hale as he carried a cardboard box out of the flea market on a cold Saturday morning in South Seattle. 20 cracked, scratched, barely functional smartphones piled on top of each other like a graveyard of broken promises. That box had cost him exactly $100, every last dollar he had. To the people watching, Travis looked like a man who had finally lost the plot. A single father in a threadbare jacket, renting a cramped apartment he could barely afford, scavenging a flea market for other people's discarded electronics. But that night, hunched under the weak yellow light of a rented garage, Travis Hale pressed a flathead screwdriver into the back panel of the first phone and began to take it apart. He did not see broken glass and corroded circuits. He saw something else entirely. Something that 5 years later, the entire world would be standing in line to buy. If you have ever believed in something no one else could see, stay with this story until the very end. Travis Hale had lived in the same two-bedroom apartment on the south side of Seattle for going on 3 years, and in that time the building had not gotten any warmer, the neighbors had not gotten any quieter, and the rent had not gotten any cheaper. He paid it late more months than not, stretching repair jobs across a cracked workbench in a rented garage 2 blocks away, fixing laptops for $30, swapping screens on old phones for $20, whatever kept the lights on and the refrigerator running. His daughter, Maya, was 7 years old and asked fewer questions than any child her age had a right to, as though she had quietly understood from very early on that her father was carrying something heavy and fragile at the same time. Travis kept the details to himself, the way a man does when he has made a private decision that the situation is temporary, even when the evidence suggests otherwise. The $100 he spent on 20 broken phones was not a reckless moment. It was a calculated one, though nobody standing around him at the flea market that morning would have believed it. He had spent 3 weeks watching which handsets showed up most often in the discount bins, cataloging the brand names, noting the age of the models, mentally cross-referencing what he knew about their internal architecture. The phones he chose were not random. They were from 6 different manufacturers across 2 generations of hardware, representing a spread of design philosophies that no single teardown channel on the internet had ever thought to compare side by side. Travis had a reason for every one of them, and he had no intention of explaining it to anyone in that parking lot. Nolan Pierce, who rented the garage unit next door to Travis and ran a small auto detailing business out of it, was standing near the entrance when Travis hauled the box inside. Nolan looked at the pile of dead phones, looked at Travis, and said what most people in that parking lot had probably already been thinking. "A normal person," Nolan said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, "spends their last $100 on groceries." He paused for effect, clearly enjoying himself. "You bought a box of broken electronics." Travis did not answer him. He set the box down on the workbench, pulled a fresh notepad from the shelf, uncapped a pen, and picked up the first phone. Nolan stood there for another few seconds, waiting for a response that never came, then shook his head and went back to his own side of the building. What Nolan did not see, what nobody who walked past that garage in the weeks that followed ever stopped long enough to see, was the wall behind Travis's workbench. Every inch of it was covered. Hand-drawn schematics of smartphone internals, annotated in Travis's small, careful handwriting. Sketches of battery housings and modular component frames. Color-coded diagrams showing heat distribution across different mainboard designs. And running along the top of the wall in large letters written on a strip of white masking tape, a sentence that had been there since the first week Travis moved in: "Phones should last longer than trends." That sentence was not a slogan. It was the thesis of an argument Travis had been building in his head for years, an argument he was only now beginning to find the physical evidence to support. By the end of the first night, he had taken apart 4 of the 20 phones and documented them in enough detail to fill 12 pages of notes. And on page 11, he found it, a flaw in the battery mounting architecture that appeared, in slightly different forms, across 3 of the 4 devices, manufactured by 3 entirely different companies. It was not a coincidence. It was a pattern. Travis circled it, set his pen down, and sat very still in the yellow light of that garage for a long time, because a man who has been searching for something specific feels a very particular kind of stillness when he finally finds it. 6 years before he stood in that flea market with $100 and a cardboard box, Travis Hale had been a hardware engineer at Titan Mobile, one of the mid-tier smartphone manufacturers that had spent the better part of a decade trying to climb into the same conversation as the industry giants. He was not a famous engineer. He did not give interviews or appear on panels. He was the kind of engineer who showed up early, stayed late, and spent his lunch breaks reading academic papers on thermal management and battery cell chemistry that most of his colleagues had no interest in at all. He was good at his job in a very specific and underappreciated way. He was good at making things last, at finding the places inside a device where small improvements compounded over time into something that actually mattered to the person holding it. His specialty was the intersection of heat optimization and long-term hardware durability. Travis understood better than almost anyone else on Titan's engineering floor that the single biggest reason smartphones degraded quickly was not processing power or software bloat. It was heat. Poorly managed thermal cycles, repeated thousands of times over the life of a device, degraded battery cells, warped solder joints, and slowly turned a perfectly functional piece of hardware into an expensive paperweight. He had spent 2 years developing a passive cooling system for Titan's mid-range line that would have extended average device lifespan by somewhere between 30 and 40%. The proposal was shelved after a single executive meeting, and Travis had walked out of that meeting knowing something he had not quite admitted to himself before. Dean Mercer, who ran product strategy at Titan Mobile with the confidence of a man who had confused revenue with vision, had a phrase he used whenever someone brought a durability argument to the table. "If the phone lasts too long," Dean would say, settling back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered the same line many times, "then what exactly are we selling next year?" The first time Travis heard it, he thought Dean was being flippant. The second time, he realized Dean was being completely sincere. The design philosophy at Titan, and, Travis came to understand, at most of the major players in the industry, was not built around making the best possible product. It was built around making a product just good enough to last until the next model cycle, and no longer. Travis pushed back the way an engineer pushes back, with data, with technical briefs, with documented evidence that planned obsolescence was costing consumers billions and generating electronic waste at a scale that nobody in the industry wanted to talk about publicly. He was patient about it, then persistent, then increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once eaten lunch with him started scheduling around him. His access to certain internal projects was quietly reduced. His performance reviews, which had been strong for years, began to reflect a new concern about what the company called cultural alignment, the corporate language for a man who would not stop asking inconvenient questions. He resigned on a Tuesday afternoon in March, cleaned out his desk in under 20 minutes, and drove home in silence. The marriage had already been fraying for 2 years. The financial pressure, the long hours, the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle at work and then trying to be present at home. By the time Travis left Titan, the separation had already begun in all but name, and Maya was caught in the middle of something she was too young to articulate but old enough to feel in her chest. Travis moved into the Southside apartment 6 weeks later with a duffel bag, a toolbox, and a conviction that had been hardening inside him for the better part of 4 years. If the industry was not going to build a phone that deserved the trust of the people who bought it, then he would do it himself. The garage that Travis rented on Farwell Avenue was 14 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with a concrete floor that stayed cold from October through April, and a roll-up door that stuck reliably in wet weather. It was not a place that looked like the beginning of anything significant. But Travis Hale had grown up in a house where things were repaired rather than replaced, where his father had kept a car running for 22 years through a combination of mechanical knowledge and stubborn affection for things that still worked, and he understood instinctively that the value of a space was not its appearance, but what a person was willing to do inside it. He set up his workbench against the back wall, organized his tools with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about efficiency, and began. In the first year, he tore apart more than 300 individual handsets, cataloging failures with the methodical patience of a forensic investigator. He built a database, first on paper, then in spreadsheets, cross-referencing component types, failure modes, and the design decisions that had led to each one. He was not looking for a single flaw to exploit. He was mapping an entire ecosystem of preventable failure, and what that map revealed was both damning and clarifying. The industry was not making bad phones because it lacked the engineering knowledge to make better ones. It was making phones designed to be irreplaceable rather than repairable, disposable rather than durable, because that model was profitable in the short term, and because no one had yet made the alternative commercially compelling enough to matter to a boardroom. By the second year, the disassembly work had given way to construction. Travis had accumulated enough salvaged components, chipsets, frame alloys, connector housings, battery cells pulled from devices that had failed for reasons that had nothing to do with the cells themselves, to begin building prototypes rather than merely studying failures. He worked through the problem the way a composer works through a score, laying out the architecture first in rough form and then refining it, discarding whole sections when they did not serve the central idea, returning to earlier decisions when later ones revealed a contradiction. The central idea never changed: a phone that could be trusted, not marketed as trustworthy, not certified by a body with industry ties, actually trusted in the way that a good tool earns trust from the person who uses it every day and needs it to be there when called upon. Seattle winters are not gentle, and the winters Travis worked through in that garage were among the coldest in the city's recent memory. On the nights when snow came down outside, and the temperature inside dropped to the point where his breath fogged under the work light, he pulled on a second jacket and kept going. He slept on a folding cot he had set up in the corner when the drive back to the apartment felt like too much time away from the problem. He ate meals he had packed at home and often forgot to heat up. His daughter, on the weekends when she stayed with him, sat at a small desk near the door and did her homework while her father worked across the room. And sometimes she would look up and watch him for a few minutes without saying anything. And sometimes she would ask what he was building, and he would tell her honestly that he was not entirely sure yet, but that it was going to matter. The people who had known Travis during his Titan years had mostly moved on to other companies and other concerns. A few called occasionally, and the honest answer to how he was doing, that he was sleeping in a garage and disassembling hundreds of broken smartphones in pursuit of a design philosophy the industry had already rejected, was not one that inspired confidence. Most of them quietly concluded that the pressure had gotten to him, that the combination of the lost job and the collapsed marriage had broken something in him that had not quite repaired itself. Warren Beckett was the exception. Warren had been a supply chain coordinator at Titan, not an engineer, but a man who knew where every rare component came from and how to get it when the normal channels ran dry. He had watched Travis's last years at the company with a kind of quiet admiration that he had never fully expressed. And after Travis left, Warren kept his number. He started showing up at the Farwell Avenue garage on weekends with bags of components sourced from electronics liquidators, salvage operations, and the kind of gray market suppliers that the big manufacturers either ignored or actively avoided. He never asked for money. He never asked for equity. He just brought the parts and sat on an overturned crate and watched Travis work, because he had decided early on that whatever was happening in this garage was worth witnessing. "There's a very thin line between a genius and a lunatic," Warren said one evening, watching Travis solder a prototype battery housing together for the fourth time after the first 3 attempts had failed. He let that sit for a moment. "The only thing that separates them is whether the product actually works." Travis did not look up from the soldering iron. He said, "Then I guess we'll find out." 3 weeks later, the 4th version of the prototype powered on. The screen lit up. Every component responded cleanly. Travis set it down on the workbench and stared at it without saying a word. And Warren, who was watching from across the garage, understood that this was the moment when the two of them were part of changed direction entirely. What Travis Hale had built in that garage on Farwell Avenue was not a smartphone in the way the industry understood the word. It was, in physical terms, an entirely different proposition. A device designed from its first principle around the assumption that the person who bought it would want to own it for years, not months, and that when something eventually broke, they should be able to fix it themselves without voiding a warranty or spending more than the device was worth to have it serviced. The battery was accessible. Not technically accessible the way some phones claimed, the kind that required special tools and 6 careful steps and a trip to a certified repair center. Genuinely, immediately accessible, swappable in under 30 seconds with no tools required at all. The screen assembly was modular, held in place by a locking frame rather than adhesive, designed to be replaced in under 4 minutes by anyone with a steady hand and a basic understanding of which connector went where. The main board carried clearly labeled service points and a thermal architecture that distributed heat across the chassis rather than concentrating it near the battery. The same principle Travis had proposed at Titan 5 years earlier and watched get shelved in a single afternoon meeting. The frame was built from a material that Travis had sourced through Warren's network, a reinforced composite that was slightly heavier than the glass-backed designs currently dominating the market, but absorbed impact in a way that glass never could. Travis had made one deliberate, foundational decision about this phone, and he had made it very early. He was not trying to build a device for people who wanted to feel wealthy. He was trying to build a phone for people who needed it to work, kept working, and could be kept working without spending money they did not have. He called it, in his own notes, a working person's phone, not as a marketing positioning but as a genuine engineering brief. Every decision downstream of that brief was made accordingly. Paige Sullivan found the garage through a mutual contact in the Seattle hardware community, a product reviewer who had spent 7 years covering consumer electronics and had developed a specific and well-documented frustration with annual replacement cycles. She arrived expecting to find an amateur hobbyist with a rough proof of concept. What she found instead was a man who had spent 3 years building something that answered every complaint she had ever put into print. Travis demonstrated the battery swap first, 28 seconds, bare hands, no tools. Paige watched it and asked him to do it again. He did it in 26. Then he handed her the phone, still powered on, and told her to drop it on the concrete floor. She hesitated. He nodded. She dropped it. It landed face down with a sound like something solid meeting something solid, and came up without a scratch, the screen still showing the home interface, every function responding normally. Paige Sullivan looked at Travis Hale for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been asked a question they had stopped expecting anyone to answer, and said quietly, "Where has this been?" The video she recorded in that garage over the following 3 hours began moving through the technology community within days, and by the end of the second week it had been seen by people in 41 countries. The attention arrived in a way Travis had not quite prepared himself for, despite having spent years imagining it. The technology community had spent the better part of a decade cycling through nearly identical incremental upgrades and calling it innovation, and its response to the garage video was a mixture of genuine excitement and reflexive disbelief. Some called it a stunt. Some called it a concept piece with no commercial path. A small but growing number of people watched Paige's footage of that battery swap and that drop test and started asking out loud why no major manufacturer had done any of this already. A question with a clear answer that most of them already knew but had stopped expecting anyone to address directly. The phrase "the garage engineer" appeared in a trade publication covering hardware design, and it attached itself to Travis's name almost immediately, spreading through the niche technology press before reaching general interest outlets with broader audiences. Travis answered the questions that reached him directly, declined the ones that wanted narrative more than explanation, and kept working in the garage while the world outside began paying attention in a way it had not before. Claire Monroe had been running Nova Future for 4 years by the time she saw Paige Sullivan's video. Nova Future was a technology investment fund structured explicitly to avoid the pattern Claire had watched play out repeatedly in the industry, where promising hardware companies were acquired early, and their innovations quietly absorbed or buried by companies with far more interest in protecting market position than advancing the technology. She was not interested in quick exits or portfolio management. She was interested in what she called structural disruption, the kind of change that did not merely improve an existing market, but reorganized it entirely, from the ground up. She arrived at the Farwell Avenue garage on a Tuesday morning without an appointment. Travis, who was in the middle of testing a new mainboard configuration, looked up, recognized the name when she introduced herself, and kept working. He was polite but not deferential, which was, Claire later said, the first thing that told her she was in the right place. She spent 2 hours in that garage asking detailed questions about the modular architecture, the supply chain philosophy, the cost structure, and the long-term scaling model. She was wearing clothes that cost more than Travis's monthly rent, and she was sitting on the overturned crate that Warren usually occupied, and she showed no sign of noticing the difference between this garage and the offices she normally moved through. Travis told her what he was worried about, not the technology, not the demand, but the way large companies moved when something threatened them. He did not want to spend years building something only to watch it disappear into the acquisition portfolio of the same kind of company that had fired him for caring about the people who bought their products. Claire was quiet for a moment after he said this. Then she said, "I'm not here to take your company." She met his eyes directly. "I'm here to help you keep it." Travis looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the prototype from the workbench and set it between them. They talked for another 3 hours, and by the time Claire left that evening, they had the outline of something that could move. Dean Mercer heard about Travis Hale's garage phone through the trade publications, which had begun running increasingly serious coverage of the modular design concept and its commercial implications. His initial response, offered in an internal Titan mobile strategy meeting, was dismissive in the way that executives are dismissive when they are not quite as comfortable as they are pretending to be. He called it a garage concept. He called it interesting but unscalable. He said, with the particular confidence of a man who had been wrong before but had rarely been held publicly accountable for it, that the consumer electronics market did not want repairability, it wanted aspiration. But the coverage did not go away. As it grew, analysts began modeling what a commercially successful modular smartphone might do to the annual replacement cycle that underpinned the revenue projections of every major manufacturer, including Titan. That was when Dean's team moved from dismissal to action. Rumors began circulating that Travis's manufacturing claims were exaggerated. A publication with known industry ties ran a piece raising questions about whether the battery swap mechanism could maintain water resistance certifications at production scale. A technically complex question designed to create doubt, without being specific enough to be easily refuted. Legal pressure followed, quiet and indirect. Not a lawsuit, but the suggestion of one, communicated through channels that Travis recognized immediately from his Titan years as the way large companies applied friction to small ones without leaving obvious fingerprints. And then Nolan Pierce showed up at the workbench one evening, with a warmth he had never previously demonstrated and an interest in being involved in whatever Travis was working on. Travis looked at him, looked back at the component layout on the bench, and said, calmly and without rancor, that he appreciated the thought. Then he kept working. Claire Monroe, sitting across the garage with a laptop and a set of production cost projections, did not look up. But later, after Nolan had gone, she said to Travis, "The fact that they're pushing back this hard means they already know exactly what it is." Travis nodded slowly. "People only laugh at an idea," he said, "until it starts to threaten them." Claire closed the laptop. She had already been in conversation with the TechSphere Expo organizing committee for 2 weeks. She asked Travis that night whether he was ready to stop being the best-kept secret in hardware design. He said he was ready. TechSphere Expo convened every year in a convention center large enough to hold the full ambition of the global technology industry's need to announce itself to itself. The floor was divided into zones. Major manufacturers occupied enormous, carefully lit pavilions with curved display walls and product pedestals that could have been mistaken for altars. Journalists, analysts, investors, and the kind of industry observers who had attended enough of these events to know exactly where the real news would come from, circulated through the aisles with press badges and practiced expressions of calibrated interest. Hale Mobile's booth was near the eastern entrance, in the section allocated to emerging companies and independent developers. It was the smallest branded space in that row, a clean white display table, a single overhead light, and a prototype unit mounted on a clear stand. No curved screens, no brand ambassadors in coordinated outfits, no ambient soundtrack designed to suggest that the future had already arrived and was available in 3 colors. Just the phone, the table, and Travis Hale standing beside it in a dark jacket, looking exactly like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to show. Dean Mercer passed the booth in the late morning on the first day of the expo. He paused, surveyed the modest setup, and made a remark to the colleagues flanking him about garage startups with theatrical ambitions and no path to production scale. His colleagues offered the appropriate laughs. Dean moved on toward the pavilion where Titan Mobile had spent 6 figures creating the impression of inevitability. The main stage presentation was scheduled for the second afternoon. Claire Monroe walked out to a packed auditorium and began, not with a pitch or a product demonstration, but with a question: how many people in the room were currently carrying a smartphone less than 2 years old, and how many of them had replaced a device in the past 12 months, not because it had stopped working, but because the manufacturer had made it too difficult or expensive to repair. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of an audience being managed. It was the silence of people recognizing something they had individually accepted as normal, and were only now hearing named out loud in a room full of other people who had accepted the same thing. The presentation that followed was methodical and unadorned. The large screens showed the battery swap, 30 seconds, bare hands, no tools. They showed the screen replacement, 4 minutes, basic components, no service center required. They showed a drop test, a water exposure sequence, and then a 5-year durability projection based on independent laboratory testing that Travis had arranged through a materials engineering firm in Portland. And then, at the end, the logo appeared. Holly Mobile in clean white letters on a dark background, simple and without ceremony. The auditorium stayed quiet for a moment that lasted longer than comfortable silence usually lasts. The phone on the demonstration table had just survived a test sequence that would have severely compromised every flagship device currently on the market. It was priced below the mid-range category. It was repairable by its owner. It had been designed, from its first component to its last, by a man who had been laughed at in a parking lot for buying broken electronics with his last $100. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, an analyst who covered consumer hardware for one of the major investment firms leaned over to the person beside him and said, in a voice that was quieter than he intended, "This changes the pricing conversation for the entire sector." He was not wrong. Then the questions started. Then the press moved. Then, before the expo's second day was over, the pre-order infrastructure that Claire's team had set up as a quiet experiment was no longer quiet at all. The orders came through the night and passed by morning, a threshold that no independent hardware company had reached at a product launch in years. The years that followed the TechSphere launch were not easy years. They were years of the particular and demanding difficulty that attaches to building something real at scale, to translating a philosophy proved in a garage on Farwell Avenue into a supply chain, a production facility, a customer service infrastructure, and a warranty program that meant what it said. Hale Mobile opened a production facility outside Portland with component sourcing standards that were as unconventional as the phone itself. Suppliers chosen partly for their ability to meet repairability and recyclability benchmarks. Manufacturing processes documented and shared publicly so that independent repair shops could service the devices without proprietary tooling. A 4-year warranty that covered the hardware in the way that warranties used to cover things before the industry decided that shorter terms were better for business. The consumer response built slowly at first, and then in the way that things built on genuine utility tend to build, steadily, without the spike and fade pattern of novelty. The people who bought Hale Mobile devices did not buy them the way people buy status objects. They bought them the way people buy things they intend to keep. Reviews from ordinary users said the same things over and over. The battery still performed well after 2 years of daily use. The screen replacement had been handled at home, with a kit ordered online for less than the cost of a dinner out. The device felt like it had been made by someone who expected it to still be working in 5 years. That last point mattered more than any benchmark score, because it spoke to a relationship between a product and its owner that the industry had spent decades systematically dismantling and had come to treat as commercially undesirable. The users who talked about Hale Mobile online were not fans in the usual consumer electronics sense. They were people who had stopped expecting the thing in their pocket to respect their investment, and who were responding with the particular loyalty of someone who has been surprised by honesty. The industry's response was slower and more reluctant, but it was unmistakable. Within 2 years of the TechSphere launch, 3 major manufacturers had announced modular battery programs. Within 3 years, 2 of the largest handset producers in the world had published revised sustainability commitments that read, in places, like imprecise paraphrases of the philosophy Travis had been arguing for since his final years at Titan Mobile. None of them credited him. All of them had been watching him. Titan Mobile's trajectory in this period moved in the opposite direction entirely. The company's revenue had been built on a replacement cycle that modular design made unnecessary, and its product line had no compelling answer to the durability question that Hale Mobile had placed at the center of the consumer conversation. Dean Mercer left the company in a restructuring that the trade press described as a strategic realignment, which was the polite language for a company that had spent years moving in the wrong direction and was now paying for it at a pace that could not be restructured away. The two phones Titan released in the 18 months following TechSphere were noted by reviewers as attempted responses to the modular conversation Travis had started. Both too late, too incremental, and too obviously reactive to change anything that mattered. The industry had a phrase for this kind of product. It was called following, and it was exactly what Travis had predicted the big players would do once someone forced their hand. Travis kept the garage. He could have done anything with it, sold the building, converted it, turned it into a symbol for a profile piece in a technology magazine that wanted a tidy narrative arc. Instead, he outfitted it properly for the first time. Real lighting, real ventilation, 2 additional workbenches. He turned it into what he called an open engineering space, a place where young hardware engineers, particularly those without institutional backing or industry connections, could come and work on problems that the major manufacturers had no interest in solving. He asked nothing in return. He showed up most mornings before 9 and kept a workbench near the back wall, under the masking tape strip that still read, "Phones should last longer than trends." And he worked the way he had always worked, because the work was the point, and had always been the point. The technology press eventually settled on a phrase for him that appeared in a year-end retrospective from one of the industry's most respected hardware journals. They called him the man who rebuilt smartphones from scrap. He read the piece one evening at the workbench, set the magazine down, and went back to whatever he was working on. Nolan Pierce came to the Farwell Avenue garage on a Thursday evening about 2.5 years after the TechSphere Expo, on a night when the last of the autumn light had gone down early and the street outside was quiet. He had called ahead, which was more than he had ever done in the years when he operated his detailing business next door, and looked at the light under the garage door as evidence of something he had not fully understood. Travis let him in. They stood on opposite sides of the workbench the way they had always stood, except that this time the bench between them held a 5th-generation Hale mobile prototype, rather than a box of broken flea market phones. Nolan said what he had come to say, plainly and without dressing it up. That he had been wrong, that the joke at the garage door had been easy to make and unkind in the way that easy things often are, that he had watched what Travis built across those years with something that had started as confusion and slowly settled into something he could only call respect. He stood with it honestly, which was more than Travis had expected. Travis looked at him for a moment, the way a man looks at something he has not thought about in a long time, and finds, on reflection, that it no longer carries the weight it once did. "It's all right," Travis said. He kept his hands resting easy on the bench. You were laughing at a man who was trying to fix something the entire industry had decided it was more profitable to break on purpose. He looked at the prototype between them, then back at Nolan. "I think most people would have laughed." Nolan nodded. They talked for 20 minutes about the new model, the battery improvement, a new frame material sourced from a recycling operation in Michigan. Then Nolan said goodnight and left, and Travis went back to work. Late one night, months after that conversation, after Maya had fallen asleep in the small room off the garage office that she had claimed as a study space during her high school years, Travis found himself standing in front of the storage shelf on the east wall. He pulled down a cardboard box. Not a clean, labeled storage box from the production facility system, but an old, creased box with a worn bottom that had been carried too many times. He set it on the workbench and opened it. 20 phones. The original 20, or what was left of them after 3 years of disassembly and documentation. Cracked screens, swollen batteries, mainboards with blown capacitors circled in his early handwriting, the first phone he had ever taken apart in this garage, sitting on top of the pile with its back panel missing and its internals visible under the work light. He picked it up and held it, and it looked exactly like what it had always looked like, a piece of broken electronic equipment that no reasonable person would have spent money on. Outside, through the small window above the workbench, the Seattle night was clear and quiet. Across the street and down 2 blocks, where a brick wall faced the avenue, a digital billboard cycled through its rotation and then showed, as it had been doing every few minutes since the campaign launched, the current Hale mobile advertisement, the clean white logo, the phone, and a single line of text that Travis had written himself late one evening, when someone on the marketing team had asked him what the company stood for, and he had answered without stopping to think about it. Built to last, built to be fixed, built for you. He stood there in the garage for a while, with the broken phone in his hand. The original broken phone, the very first one, the one that had started all of it. And through the window the billboard turned and the logo appeared, and the city carried on its quiet business. And Travis Hale held the beginning of everything he had built in his hands, with the same stillness he had always carried when he was certain he was in the right place. Maya would be 18 in the spring. She had told her father recently, with the particular directness of someone who had grown up watching a person build something from nothing, that she wanted to study materials science. Travis had not said much in response. He had just nodded and gone back to the bench, and the expression on his face was the kind that cannot be performed. It has to be earned, slowly, across years of mornings in a cold garage before anyone was watching. There are people who look at a broken phone and see the end of its usefulness, something to be thrown away, replaced, forgotten. And then there are people who look at the same broken phone and see, inside its failed circuits and cracked glass, the blueprint of something the world has not yet been offered. The distance between those two kinds of people is not intelligence, and it is not money, and it is not education or luck or any of the things that get credited in the stories told afterward. The distance is simply this: one of them keeps looking, long after everyone else has moved on. Travis set the phone back in the box. He closed the lid. He turned to the workbench, under the light that had never stopped burning, and he went back to work.